Frank Morris crouched in the pitch-black utility corridor behind his cell wall, his heart pounding so hard he thought the guards would hear it. In his hands, he held a crude paddle made from raincoat material and wood scraps. Beside him, brothers John and Clarence Anglin waited in the darkness, their faces barely visible. Outside, beyond the thick concrete walls of Alcatraz, the icy waters of San Francisco Bay churned. For months, they've been planning this, drilling through concrete, stealing materials, building an inflatable raft. Now, after 18 months of meticulous preparation, they were minutes away from attempting the impossible. What Frank didn't know was that in less than 12 hours, their empty cells would trigger the most extensive manhunt in FBI history, and 62 years later, the world would still be asking, did they survive, or did the bay swallow them whole? Frank Lee Morris stepped off the prison boat on Alcatraz Island, shackled and surrounded by armed guards. At 33 years old, he was already a legend in the federal prison system. A genius-level IQ of 133, multiple escape attempts from other prisons, and a rap sheet that started when he was just 13. The guard who processed him looked at his file and shook his head. "Morris, you've escaped from every prison they've put you in. Let's see you get out of this one." Frank said nothing, but his eyes scanned everything. The guard rotations, the cell block layout, the distance to the water. He'd been sent to Alcatraz specifically because he was an escape risk. What the Bureau of Prisons didn't realize was that they'd just given Frank Morris the ultimate challenge, and he never backed down from challenge. In the recreation yard, Frank Morris stood alone against the chain-link fence, watching the San Francisco skyline shimmer in the distance. Just 1.5 miles of freezing water separated Alcatraz from freedom. That's when two men approached him. John and Clarence Anglin, brothers from Florida who'd been transferred to Alcatraz after a botched escape attempt from Atlanta Penitentiary. John, the older brother at 31, spoke first. "You're Morris. We heard about you. Atlanta, Louisiana State Pen, Florida State Prison. You've hit them all." Frank sized them up. "Heard about you, too. Bank robbers. Multiple escapes. What do you want?" Clarence, 29, leaned in close and whispered, "We want out. And we hear you're the man with the plan." Frank looked at them for a long moment, then smiled slightly. "Meet me in the Industries building tomorrow. We've got work to do." What happens next is the most brilliant prison escape plan ever conceived. If you want to see how 3 inmates outsmarted the FBI, the Coast Guard, and the most secure prison in America, hit that subscribe button right now. Frank was assigned to work in the Prison Industries building, where inmates manufactured furniture and clothing. It was here that he made the discovery that would change everything. While moving equipment, he noticed that the ventilation grates in the utility corridors were secured with old, rusted bolts. He tested one when no guard was looking. It moved. Just slightly, but it moved. That night, back in his cell on Block B, Frank examined the concrete wall around his ventilation grate. Alcatraz had been built in the 1930s, and after 3 decades of salt air and moisture, the concrete had weakened. He took a spoon from dinner and scraped the wall near his vent. Concrete dust fell away. His mind raced. If he could get through this wall, he'd access the utility corridor. And if he could access the corridor, he could reach the roof. And if he could reach the roof, he could get to the water. The plan was forming. Frank, John, and Clarence brought a 4th man into their plan. Alan West, a car thief from New York who occupied the cell adjacent to Frank's. West had connections. He could get materials, tools, and information. In the prison yard, the 4 men stood in a tight circle, speaking in whispers. Frank laid out the plan. "We dig through the walls around our ventilation grates. We steal tools from the Industries building, drill bits, spoons, anything sharp. We work at night, during lights out. We take turns keeping watch. The concrete is old and weak. We can get through in 6 months, maybe less." John Anglin asked, "And then what?" "We still got to get off this rock." Frank's eyes glinted. "We build a raft. There's a popular mechanics magazine in a library with instructions for making life vests from raincoats. We steal raincoats from the Industries building, seal them with steam from the pipes, and make flotation devices. We wait for the right tide, and we paddle to Angel Island, then to the mainland." Alan West stared at him. "You're crazy." Frank smiled. "Crazy enough to try." August 1st, 1960, 11:45 p.m., 10 months before escape. Frank Morris lay in his cell, lights out, listening. The guard's footsteps echoed down the corridor. 9:45 p.m. count, right on schedule. He waited until the footsteps faded, then pulled out a sharpened spoon handle he'd been hiding in his mattress. He began scraping the concrete around his ventilation grate, working slowly and methodically. The sound was barely audible, masked by the ambient noise of the prison, distant conversations, coughing, the wind howling outside. After 30 minutes, he'd removed a small pile of concrete dust, which he carefully swept into a makeshift bag made from toilet paper. In the morning, he'd flush it down the toilet. In the adjacent cells, John, Clarence, and Alan were doing the same thing. The escape had begun. September 20th, 1960, 1:30 p.m., 8.5 months before escape. Frank worked in a furniture shop, operating a saw under the watchful eye of a guard. But guards got bored, guards got distracted, and Frank was patient. When the guard stepped away to check on another inmate, Frank slipped a small drill bit into his sock. It took him 3 seconds. Later that day, John Anglin accidentally knocked over a can of paint in the clothing factory, creating a diversion while Clarence pocketed a wrench. By October, they had accumulated an impressive toolkit: drill bits, wrenches, spoons filed into chisels, a small hand drill borrowed from the maintenance department, and even a small motor from a vacuum cleaner that they converted into a makeshift rotary drill. They hid everything in the utility corridor behind their cells, in a space they'd already opened up. September 20th, 1960, 1:30 p.m., 8.5 months before escape. Frank worked in a furniture shop, operating a saw under the watchful eye of a guard. But guards got bored, guards got distracted, and Frank was patient. When the guard stepped away to check on another inmate, Frank slipped a small drill bit into his sock. It took him 3 seconds. Later that day, John Anglin accidentally knocked over a can of paint in the clothing factory, creating a diversion while Clarence pocketed a wrench. By October, they had accumulated an impressive toolkit: drill bits, wrenches, spoons filed into chisels, a small hand drill borrowed from the maintenance department, and even a small motor from a vacuum cleaner that they'd converted into a makeshift rotary drill. They hid everything in the utility corridor behind their cells, in a space they'd already opened up. November 5th, 1960, 7 p.m., 7 months before escape. The next problem was the nightly guard counts. Even if they escaped their cells, guards would notice empty beds during the 12 a.m., 3 a.m., and 5 a.m. checks. Frank's solution was brilliant and disturbing. They would create dummy heads to place in their beds. Using toilet paper, soap, and concrete dust mixed with water to create a paste, they sculpted realistic-looking heads. They stole hair from the barber shop floor, sweeping it up after haircuts and smuggling it back to their cells. They painted the heads with flesh-colored paint stolen from the art supplies. The level of detail was extraordinary. Frank even added wrinkles and a slight smile to his dummy. When he placed it on his pillow one night as a test, he stood back and examined it in the dim light. It looked real, disturbingly real. December 1960 to January 1961, 6 to 7 months before escape. Over 2 months, the 4 men stole more than 50 raincoats from the clothing factory and the storage areas. In the utility corridor at night, they worked by the light of a small flashlight to construct their escape raft and life vests. Following instructions from a magazine article, they glued the raincoats together using contact cement stolen from the industry's building. They tested the seals by inflating sections with air from concertina, a musical instrument Alan West had borrowed, and checking for leaks. The raft was 6 feet by 14 feet when inflated. It wouldn't be comfortable, but it would float. They also made life vests, sealing arm and leg sections of raincoats to create flotation devices. Everything was hidden in the utility corridor, waiting for the right moment. February 14th, 1961, 2:30 a.m., 4 months before escape. Frank Morris lay awake in his cell, staring at the ceiling. They'd been working for 6 months, and his hole was almost complete. He could fit his head and shoulders through the opening behind his ventilation grate. But doubt crept in. The water temperature in San Francisco Bay in June averaged 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Hypothermia could set in within 30 minutes. The currents were treacherous. Sharks were rare, but present. And even if they made it to shore, they'd be fugitives for life. Was it worth it? He thought about his childhood, abandoned by his parents, raised in foster homes, 13 years old when he committed his first crime. He thought about the past 14 years he'd spent in various prisons. Then he thought about dying in Alcatraz, old and forgotten. He made his decision. He'd rather die trying to escape than live the rest of his life in this cage. March 30th, 1961, 11 p.m., 2.5 months before escape. Frank pushed against the ventilation grate in his cell. It gave way, and for the first time, he squeezed through the hole he'd spent 8 months creating. He emerged into the utility corridor, a dark, narrow space between the cell block wall and the outer prison wall. He could stand up. He could move. He clicked on his flashlight and looked around. Pipes ran along the ceiling. The corridor extended in both directions. Above him, he could see the ventilation shaft that led to the roof. This was it. This was the way out. He quickly returned to his cell, replaced the grate, and covered the hole with his fake wall panel made from cardboard painted to look like concrete. When the guard did his midnight count, Frank's dummy head was on his pillow, and Frank was lying in bed, heart racing. Within 2 weeks, John and Clarence had also broken through. Alan West was still working on his hole. The concrete around his vent was thicker. May 15th, 1962, 3 p.m., 4 weeks before escape. The 4 men gathered in the prison yard during recreation time. Frank had been studying tide charts from the library and weather patterns for newspapers. June 11th, he announced quietly. New moon, high tide at 11 p.m., and the weather forecast shows clear skies. We'll never get better conditions. John Anglin nodded. We're ready. The raft's complete. The vests are done. We've got paddles. Frank turned to Alan West. What about your hole? West's face tightened. Almost there. I'll be ready. Frank stared at him. You better be, because we're not waiting. June 11th at 9:30 p.m. we go. If you're not through your wall by then, you're staying behind. The date was set. Less than 4 weeks to freedom or death. June 10th, 1962, 8 p.m., 26 hours before escape. Frank did a final check of his equipment. Dummy head, ready. Fake wall panel, painted and positioned. Clothing. He'd wear multiple layers for warmth. Life vest, hidden in the utility corridor. Paddle, constructed from wood and raincoat material. He also had a small amount of cash he'd saved from his prison work assignments, $5.50. Not much, but better than nothing if they made it to shore. In his mind, he rehearsed every step. 9:30 p.m., remove fake wall, enter corridor. 9:45 p.m., climb ventilation shaft to roof. 10 p.m., descend exterior of building using pipes. 10:15 p.m., reach shoreline. 10:30 p.m., inflate raft. 11 p.m., enter water at high tide. If everything went perfectly, they'd paddle with the current toward Angel Island, rest, then continue to the Marin Headlands by dawn. Frank allowed himself a small smile. Tomorrow night, he'd be free or dead. Either way, he'd never spend another night in this cell. June 11th, 1962, 2 p.m., 9.5 hours before escape. Frank worked in the industries building, acting completely normal. He ate lunch. He talked to other inmates. He followed every rule. A guard commented, "Morris, you seem in a good mood today." Frank replied, "It's Monday. Fresh start to the week." Inside, his mind was racing through the plan, checking every detail, anticipating every problem. At 4 p.m., back in his cell, he had his final conversation with Alan West through the wall. "You ready?" Frank whispered. "Yeah," West replied, but Frank heard uncertainty in his voice. "You sure? Because if you're not through that wall by 9:30, we're leaving without you." "I'll be ready," West insisted. Frank hoped he was telling the truth. June 11th, 1962, 9:30 p.m., hour 0. The lights dimmed in cell block B. Frank lay in his bed, fully clothed, waiting. He heard the guard's 9:30 p.m. count. Footsteps approaching, pausing at each cell, then moving on. The guard saw Frank's dummy head on the pillow and moved to the next cell. As soon as the footsteps faded, Frank moved with practiced efficiency. He removed his fake wall panel, grabbed his life vest and paddle from behind it, and squeezed through the hole into the utility corridor. In the dim light, he saw John and Clarence Anglin already waiting. "West," John whispered. They waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Frank crawled to West's cell opening and looked through. West was frantically chipping at his hole. It wasn't wide enough yet. "Come on," Frank hissed. "I'm trying," West whispered back desperately. Frank made the hardest decision of his life. "We can't wait." "I'm sorry." West's face fell. "No, just give me 10 more minutes." But Frank was already moving. Time was against them. June 11th, 1962, 9:50 p.m., hour 0.33. Frank led the Anglin brothers through the utility corridor to the ventilation shaft. It was a vertical climb of approximately 30 feet to reach the roof access. Using the pipes and electrical conduits as handholds, Frank climbed first, his inflated life vest making the ascent awkward. Below him, John and Clarence followed, each carrying their own equipment. Frank's arms burned. Sweat dripped down his face despite the cold. At the top of the shaft, he encountered a large ventilation fan. They'd known about this during their reconnaissance. They'd disabled the fan's motor weeks ago. Frank pushed it aside and squeezed through the opening onto the roof. Cold night air hit his face. For the first time in years, he was outside the prison walls. He could see the lights of San Francisco twinkling across the bay. The brothers emerged behind him. No words were spoken. They moved quickly across the roof toward the edge. June 11th, 1962, 10:05 p.m., hour 0.58. At the edge of the prison roof, a 50-foot drop to the ground awaited them. But Frank had planned for this. During their preparations, they'd identified a drain pipe that ran down the exterior wall. It wasn't secure. It moved when tested, but it would have to do. Frank went first, wrapping his arms and legs around the pipe and sliding down, using friction to control his descent. Halfway down, the pipe groaned and shifted. Frank froze, his heart in his throat. The pipe held. He continued down and dropped the final 6 feet to the ground. John followed, then Clarence. They were now on the north shore of Alcatraz Island, hidden from the guard towers by the building. The water was 50 yards away. They ran, crouching low, carrying their equipment. Every second counted. June 11th, 1962, 10:20 p.m., hour 0.83. They reached the rocky shore. The water was black and churning, small waves crashing against the rocks. Frank pulled out their raft and began inflating it using the concertina. The sound of the instrument seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. Clarence kept watch while John helped Frank. The raft slowly took shape, crude, ugly, but functional. Frank's hands shook as he sealed the final section. This was it, the point of no return. Once they entered that water, they were committed. John Anglin looked at Frank. "You sure about this?" Frank looked at the dark water, then at the prison behind them, then back at John. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." They put on their life vests, grabbed their paddles, and dragged the raft to the water's edge. June 11th, 1962, 10:45 p.m., hour 1.25. Frank Morris pushed the raft into San Francisco Bay and climbed aboard. The icy water soaked through his clothes immediately. It was 53 degrees Fahrenheit. John and Clarence climbed in behind him, and they began paddling. The current grabbed them instantly, pulling them away from Alcatraz. They paddled hard, aiming for Angel Island, a dark mass about 2 miles north. The raft rode low in the water. Waves splashed over the sides. Within 5 minutes, all 3 men were soaked to the bone, shivering violently. Frank's hands were already going numb. He focused on paddling. Left, right. The lights of San Francisco seemed impossibly far away. Behind them, Alcatraz was a looming shadow. A searchlight from the prison swept across the water, and all 3 men froze, lying flat in the raft. The light passed over them. They resumed paddling. They were exhausted, freezing, and terrified. but they were free. June 11th, 1962, 11:30 p.m., hour 2. 45 minutes into their escape, disaster struck. A large wave hit the raft broadside, and Frank heard a hissing sound. They had a leak. "We're taking on water," Clarence shouted. They paddled harder, but the raft was slowly deflating. The current was pushing them past Angel Island, out toward the Golden Gate. Frank made a decision. "We're not going to make it together. The raft's dying." John Anglin yelled back, "What do we do?" Frank pointed toward the dark shoreline in the distance. "We split up. Better chance if we separate. Swim for the Marin headlands. If we make it, we meet at the place we agreed on." Before John or Clarence could respond, a wave capsized the raft. All three men went into the freezing water. Frank felt the shock of the cold. It was like being stabbed with 1,000 knives. He inflated his life vest fully and began kicking toward shore. In the darkness, he could hear John and Clarence splashing nearby. Then the current pulled them apart, and Frank Morris was alone in the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay. What happens next is one of the greatest mysteries in American criminal history. Did Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers survive? Hit that like button and subscribe, because the truth is more shocking than you can imagine. June 12th, 1962, 12:15 a.m., hour 2.75. Frank swam through the darkness, using the lights of the Golden Gate Bridge as a landmark. His life vest kept him afloat, but the cold was killing him. He could no longer feel his hands or feet. His thinking was becoming fuzzy, hypothermia. He forced himself to keep moving. Kick, breathe, kick, breathe. He had no idea where John and Clarence were. He tried calling out, but his voice was weak. The current was relentless, pushing him west toward the Pacific Ocean. Frank angled his body, trying to swim perpendicular to the current, aiming for the Marin headlands. His vision blurred. He thought about giving up, letting the water take him. It would be easy, so easy, but something in him, that same stubborn refusal to quit that had driven him to escape from every prison they put him in, kept him moving. One more kick, one more breath, one more yard. Back at Alcatraz, Officer Bill Long conducted the morning count in cell block B. He reached Frank Morris's cell and saw the head on the pillow. But something was off. The head hadn't moved since the midnight count. Long approached closer and touched it. It was made of soap and paper. His heart stopped. He ran to the next cell, John Anglin. Another dummy. Then Clarence Anglin's cell. Another dummy. Long's hand shook as he radioed the control center. "We have escapees. 3 men missing from Block B. Morris and the Anglin brothers." Within minutes, alarms screamed across the island. The warden was notified. The FBI was called. The Coast Guard launched boats. Police helicopters took off from San Francisco. The biggest manhunt in history had begun. But Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers had a 9-hour head start. June 12th, 1962, 9 a.m. Guards interrogated Alan West, who'd been left behind. Broken and angry, West told them everything. The months of planning, the dummy heads, the raft, the escape route. He showed them the hole in his cell wall that he'd finally finished breaking through at 11 p.m., 30 minutes too late. He showed them the utility corridor, the ventilation shaft, the roof access. He explained the raft construction, the life vests, the paddles. FBI agents took notes furiously. One agent asked, "Where were they planning to go if they made it to shore?" West shrugged. "Frank never told us. He said it was safer if we didn't know. But I know he had contacts in Mexico." He talked about going south. The FBI began searching every inch of the bay for bodies or survivors. June 12th, 1962, 2 p.m., afternoon. Coast Guard boats combed San Francisco Bay. At 2:15 p.m., they found debris floating near Alcatraz, pieces of the raft made from raincoat material. At 3:30 p.m., they found paddles floating near Angel Island. At 4 p.m., they found a life vest washed up on the Marin County shore. But no bodies. The FBI photographed everything and took it back to their lab. They analyzed the construction, the materials, the workmanship. One agent remarked, "This is the most sophisticated escape attempt in Alcatraz history." These men weren't dumb criminals. They were engineers. But the question remained, had they survived? The water temperature and currents suggested death by hypothermia was almost certain. Yet without bodies, the FBI couldn't close the case. June 12, 1962, 8 p.m., press conference. The FBI held a press conference. Special agent in charge Frank Price addressed the media. We believe that Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin drowned in San Francisco Bay during their escape attempt. The water temperature, the currents, and the distance to shore make survival unlikely. However, we are continuing to search and investigate all leads. These men are to be considered armed and dangerous if encountered. Reporters shouted questions. Why didn't the guards notice they were missing sooner? How did they get the tools to dig through concrete? Could they have survived? Price answered carefully, revealing as little as possible. But inside, the FBI was embarrassed. 3 inmates had escaped from the Inescapable prison. Whether they'd survived or not, it was a black eye for the Bureau of Prisons. January 2013. In 2013, the San Francisco Police Department received a letter. It was handwritten and unsigned, but the writer claimed to be John Anglin. The letter read, "My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely. Frank passed away in October 2008. His grave is in Argentina under a different name. My brother died in 2011. I'm the last one alive. This is no joke." The letter provided details only the real John Anglin would know. The FBI analyzed the handwriting and couldn't definitively prove or disprove its authenticity. To this day, the letter remains one of the most tantalizing pieces of evidence that the men may have survived. December 25, 1975, Christmas Day, 13 years after escape. According to the Anglin family, on Christmas Day, 1975, a mysterious package arrived at their mother's home in Florida. Inside were photographs of 2 men who looked remarkably like John and Clarence Anglin, but older. The photos showed the men in what appeared to be a South American setting, tropical plants, adobe-style buildings. The family claimed the men in the photos were definitely John and Clarence, alive and well 13 years after the escape. They refused to share the original photos with the FBI for decades. In 2015, the photos were finally analyzed using facial recognition technology. The results were inconclusive but suggested a strong resemblance. The family maintained until their deaths that John and Clarence had survived and lived in Brazil for years. 2003 to 41 years after escape. In 2003, a man named Fred Britzi, an old criminal associate of the Anglin brothers, was dying of cancer. Before he passed, he told his family a secret he'd kept for 40 years. In the late 1970s, he'd traveled to Brazil and met with John and Clarence Anglin in a remote farming community. They were alive, using different names, working as farmers. Britzi said he'd even taken photographs of them, the same photos the family later released. He claimed that Frank Morris had also survived initially, but had separated from the brothers and gone to Mexico. Britzi's family had no reason to believe he was lying, but they also had no way to verify his story. The FBI investigated and found records of Britzi's travel to Brazil, but couldn't confirm the meeting. December 31st, 1979, 17 years after escape. On December 31st, 1979, the FBI officially closed the Alcatraz escape investigation. Their conclusion: Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin are presumed deceased. Based on available evidence, including water temperatures, tidal currents, and lack of confirmed sightings, the FBI believes the subjects drowned in San Francisco Bay on the night of June 11th to 12th, 1962. However, the case was never fully closed by the U.S. Marshals Service, which continues to investigate leads even today. The Marshals maintain age-progressed photos of all 3 men and follow up on tips. As of 2024, if they survived, Frank Morris would be 97 years old, John Anglin would be 94, and Clarence would be 93. The case remains open. Present day, 62 years later, So what really happened to Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers? The truth is, we don't know. The official position is that they drowned, but the evidence is ambiguous. No bodies were ever found. The raft fragments and paddles suggest they didn't make it far, but none of their life vests were recovered. The 2013 letter, if authentic, suggests at least John Anglin survived into his 80s. The family photos, while disputed, show a striking resemblance. And witnesses over the years have reported sightings of the men in Brazil, Mexico, and even back in the United States. What we do know is this. Frank Morris was a criminal genius with an IQ of 133 who spent 18 months planning the most sophisticated prison escape in American history. John and Clarence Anglin were tough, resourceful brothers who'd attempted escapes before and nearly succeeded. Together, they accomplished what was supposed to be impossible. They escaped from Alcatraz. Whether they survived the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay and built new lives in South America, or whether they drowned within hours of their escape, we may never know for certain. But on the night of June 11th, 1962, three men looked at an impossible situation and decided to try anyway. They spent 18 months turning stolen spoons into digging tools, raincoats into rafts, and soap into fake heads. They outsmarted guards, beat security systems, and vanished into the night. Alcatraz closed as a federal prison in 1963, partially because of the embarrassment of the Morris Anglin escape. It now stands as a museum, and tour guides still tell the story of Cell Block B, cells 138, 140, and 152. The cells where three men prove that no prison is truly escape-proof if you're smart enough, brave enough, and desperate enough. The FBI may have closed their investigation, but 62 years later, people are still searching for answers. And somewhere, in an unmarked grave in Argentina, in a nursing home in Brazil, or at the bottom of San Francisco Bay, Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin rest with the ultimate secret. Did they make it, or did the Bay claim them? The only certainty is this: they escaped Alcatraz. Everything after that is mystery, legend, and hope.